The flight was boarding smoothly until a flight attendant abruptly stopped beside a young boy sitting quietly in first class. Her eyes narrowed with undisguised suspicion as she stared down at him. "Excuse me, where's your guardian? This seat obviously isn't for someone like you," Veronica Hart said coldly, her voice dripping with judgment as her eyes lingered disdainfully over Noah Sinclair's dark skin. Noah's small hands tightened around Annie, his worn-out stuffed teddy bear trembling slightly as fear and confusion welled up inside him. Before Noah could respond, Veronica roughly grabbed his arm, shoving him forcefully back into his seat. Passengers around them glanced uneasily but quickly turned away, choosing silence rather than intervening. Veronica believed Noah was just another kid trying to sneak into first class. What she didn't realize was that Alexander Kane, the influential CEO and owner of the airline, had quietly witnessed the entire exchange through the airline's onboard security feed, and he was also Noah's father. By the time the flight landed, Veronica wouldn't just lose her job, she'd lose everything. The quiet hum of the aircraft continued as Noah sat nervously, his legs dangling just above the plush carpeted floor. He struggled with the seatbelt, his muscles stiffening painfully as he tried desperately to calm his racing heart. Though his father had reassured him countless times that flying alone would be fine, Veronica's harsh words echoed painfully in his ears, reminding him of a prejudice he was far too young to understand. And she prided herself on maintaining perfect order. In Veronica Hart's mind, first class was reserved strictly for distinguished, well-behaved passengers, those who fit her narrow vision of who deserved luxury. As her gaze lingered disdainfully over Noah Sinclair, her judgment was unmistakably clear. "This seat isn't a playground," Veronica snapped coldly, her voice edged with contempt as her eyes fell pointedly on Annie, the well-loved stuffed teddy bear in Noah's trembling hands. "First class is reserved for respectable passengers, not for children who obviously don't know their place." Noah's fingers tightened protectively around Annie, heart pounding painfully in his chest. He opened his mouth slightly, desperately trying to form the words that tangled stubbornly in his throat. When overwhelmed, his speech always failed him, and now, trapped beneath Veronica's unforgiving stare, words felt impossible. Panic coiled tighter in his chest as he struggled silently to explain himself. Veronica sighed loudly, rolling her eyes with obvious annoyance. Without any warning, she abruptly grabbed Noah's thin arm again, her fingers digging harshly into his skin as she roughly shoved him back into the seat. "I said sit still," she hissed impatiently, her voice sharp and cutting. "You're making a scene." Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, eyes flickering nervously between Noah and the flight attendant, discomfort briefly visible on their faces. Yet not one person intervened. Instead, they quickly returned their eyes to their screens or pretended to read their books, silently complicit in the injustice they'd just witnessed, too comfortable in their privilege to speak up for the frightened child beside them. Tears welled up uncontrollably in Noah's eyes, and he gasped softly as his body stiffened painfully from Veronica's violent grip. He shrank into his seat, desperately wishing he could explain that he was trying his best, that he didn't mean to cause trouble, that it wasn't his fault. But the heavy knot in his throat prevented any words from escaping, suffocating him beneath the cruel weight of being treated as less than, unwanted, and out of place. With trembling fingers, Noah reached for his tablet, screen flickering to life as he activated the voice message his father had carefully instructed him to use if anything ever went wrong. He spoke quietly, voice shaking with a heartbreaking vulnerability. "Daddy, the lady hurt my arm. She says I can't stay here. I just want to go home." He pressed send, heart aching as he placed the tablet down. The feeling burned deeper than humiliation or pain. It was the agony of realizing that in Veronica's eyes, he wasn't simply a passenger or even a child. He was a problem, an inconvenience, a mistake to be corrected. Veronica Hart straightened her uniform smugly, indifferent to Noah's silent distress. To her, this was merely another routine correction, another inconvenience swiftly managed. She had no idea that the shaky, tearful voice message Noah just sent had already reached Alexander Kane, the CEO and powerful owner of the airline, and the boy's devoted father. As Noah stared anxiously at the tablet, the status quietly changed to delivered. His heart pounded harder. He knew his father had heard him now. He blinked rapidly, fighting the humiliation that threatened to spill down his cheeks. He didn't want to cry, especially not here in front of all these indifferent strangers. But he could feel the suffocating tightness in his chest, knowing this injustice wouldn't remain unnoticed. And by the time the plane landed, Veronica Hart would come to realize the true price of her cruel assumptions. The tables were about to turn, and this time, justice wouldn't be silent. Veronica Hart prided herself on strict discipline in her section. First class, to her, was a sanctuary reserved for those who knew precisely how to behave. Sophisticated, mature passengers who understood the dignity required of the premium cabin. In her eyes, Noah Sinclair simply didn't belong. A child, especially one clutching a worn teddy bear like Annie, represented nothing but inconvenience and disorder. As Noah's quiet sobs softly echoed through the luxurious cabin, Veronica sighed dismissively, rolling her eyes with palpable annoyance. To her, he was no different than any disruptive child who had somehow wandered into a place they didn't deserve. She'd seen it countless times. Irresponsible parents letting their kids disturb first-class tranquility. Noah's trembling hands and frightened eyes meant nothing to her. If he couldn't behave, he clearly didn't belong here, regardless of his ticket. A few steps away, Priya Lopez, a younger, gentler flight attendant, watched the scene unfold, an uncomfortable tightness growing in her chest. She hesitated, glancing anxiously between Veronica and the frightened boy. Finally gathering courage, Priya stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm enough to challenge her superior. "Veronica, was that really necessary?" Veronica barely spared Priya a glance. "Necessary?" she scoffed coldly, folding her arms. "That child was causing a disturbance. He needs to learn how to behave himself properly." Priya's eyebrows furrowed, disbelief crossing her features. "But he's just a kid," she countered gently, glancing towards Noah again. "Did you see his hands trembling? He clearly needed help, not harsh treatment." Veronica's face hardened, her voice dripping with contempt. "Then he shouldn't be flying alone in first class. If he can't handle behaving appropriately, he doesn't belong here. Honestly, children like him never do." Priya felt her stomach twist, stunned by the cruel implication hidden behind Veronica's words. She opened her mouth to protest further, but Veronica's dismissive glare warned her that pushing harder would only escalate the situation. Priya clenched her fists helplessly, the unfairness pressing down on her like a physical weight. Turning slightly, she glanced back at Noah, her heart aching as she saw him curled into his seat, desperately clutching Annie, his small body shaking with suppressed tears. Hundreds of miles away, in a sleek high-rise office, Alexander Kane was finishing up a routine business call when his phone suddenly vibrated. Glancing quickly, his heart skipped a beat as he saw a notification from Noah. Instantly swiping the message, he listened intently as Noah's soft, trembling voice filled the room. "Daddy? Daddy? The lady hurt my arm. She said I can't be here. I want to go home." Alexander's entire body stiffened with quiet, barely contained rage. His jaw clenched tightly as he replayed his son's tearful words, Noah's shaky voice filled with confusion and hurt. Silence settled heavily around him, punctuated only by his son's fragile plea. Alexander leaned forward slowly, his voice controlled but razor-sharp, as he pressed the button to summon his assistant, Nathan Reed. "Mr. Kane?" Nathan quickly responded. "I need the details of Noah's flight." "Immediately," Alexander commanded, his tone dangerous and icy. "Right away, sir," Nathan responded instantly, sensing urgency in his boss's tone. Alexander sat back, fingers tapping impatiently against his polished mahogany desk. Anger surged through him. Not the loud, visible kind, but a quiet fury reserved only for moments when injustice touched his family. Someone had laid hands on his son. Someone had made Noah, his boy, feel as if he didn't belong simply because he was different, because he didn't match some preconceived notion of who belonged in first class. That someone, Veronica Hart, had no idea of the storm she'd just unleashed. As Alexander waited for flight details, he exhaled deeply, eyes cold and focused. By the time that plane landed, Veronica Hart would discover exactly what happens when judgment and prejudice collide with the force of accountability. And whoever it was, they had no idea whose child they'd just mistreated. Alexander Kane sat perfectly still, his fingertips tapping rhythmically against the polished surface of his mahogany desk. His expression remained deceptively calm, but beneath that composed exterior, his patience had worn razor thin. Alexander wasn't a man prone to losing his temper easily, but when it came to Noah, his own son, there were no second chances. Taking a deep breath, Alexander exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of his phone as he dialed his assistant's number. "Nathan?" Alexander's voice was steady, calm, but dangerously sharp. "I want the captain of that flight on the line. Now." "Yes, sir," Nathan Reed responded swiftly, sensing the barely contained fury beneath his employer's measured tone. "I'll connect you within 5 minutes." Ending the call, Alexander exhaled deliberately, his jaw tightening. This was more than just an employee mishandling a passenger. Someone had physically harmed his son, had humiliated Noah and treated him like an outsider. He could already predict the excuses. Veronica Hart would undoubtedly try to minimize her actions, dismissing the incident as a minor misunderstanding, or blaming Noah's restlessness and discomfort. Alexander had seen this prejudice before. People saw Noah's quiet struggles, his small hands that trembled easily, and immediately assumed he didn't belong, judging him harshly simply because he moved or acted differently. Meanwhile, aboard the aircraft, Veronica Hart strode confidently down the first-class aisle, casually adjusting her pristine uniform as if nothing had happened. A smug satisfaction curled her lips upward as she noticed that Noah Sinclair had finally fallen quiet, no longer disturbing the peace she guarded so fiercely. Throughout her career, she dealt with countless difficult passengers, entitled executives, demanding travelers, those she saw as nuisances, and had always come out on top. Veronica firmly believed a child like Noah, quiet yet visibly uncomfortable, had no rightful place in her carefully ordered first-class cabin, and she had no intention of catering to him further. From the galley, however, Priya Lopez watched Veronica closely, unable to shake the sickening discomfort growing in her stomach. Priya's gaze shifted toward Noah, curled protectively into his seat, gripping Annie, the worn teddy bear, as if his life depended on it. His dark eyes were wide with lingering distress, silently fighting back tears of humiliation. Summoning courage, Priya stepped hesitantly toward Veronica, her voice lowered but insistent. "Veronica, was that really necessary?" Veronica glanced dismissively at Priya, her lips twisting into a contemptuous smirk. "Necessary?" she scoffed bitterly. "That child was causing a disturbance, Priya. He needs to learn his place. Children like him always bring chaos." Priya's brow furrowed deeply. "He's just a kid. Did you even see him? His hands were trembling. He wasn't being disruptive. He clearly needed help." Veronica let out an impatient sigh, her voice sharp with barely disguised disdain. "Then perhaps children like him shouldn't be allowed alone in first class." The venomous implication hung clearly between them. Priya fell silent, the heaviness of Veronica's prejudice leaving her speechless. She turned away, glancing anxiously at Noah again. He had shrunk deeper into his seat, his thin frame shaking softly with suppressed tears. Desperately clutching Annie, his worn teddy bear, as if trying to shield himself from Veronica's cruel words and actions. His quiet suffering stirred a painful unease within Priya, a gnawing feeling that something here had gone terribly wrong, something that desperately needed correcting. Yet, in that moment, Veronica Hart felt victorious, confidently adjusting her uniform once more as she resumed her rounds through first class, oblivious to the storm that was rapidly approaching. She didn't know that Alexander Kane, the very man whose quiet fury was about to shatter her entire world, had already connected with Captain Daniel Mercer, determined to hold her accountable for every careless judgment and unjust action against his son. Priya Lopez quietly approached Noah Sinclair's seat and crouched down, her voice gentle and soft. "Hey," she whispered carefully. "Are you okay?" Noah hesitated, his eyes red from unshed tears, his breathing still uneven. He didn't speak but slowly shook his head, clearly overwhelmed. Priya swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in her chest. She carefully lowered her voice further, asking gently, Did Veronica Hart hurt your arm?" Noah glanced down at the faint red marks left by Veronica's harsh grip. After a pause that felt painfully long, he nodded slowly, confirming her fears. Priya felt a lump form in her throat, her stomach twisting uncomfortably. She knew the truth already, but hearing it directly from Noah made it feel unbearably real. She gently reached out, trying to offer comfort. "Do you need anything?" she asked softly. After another long hesitation, Noah whispered faintly, his voice trembling, "I want my dad." Priya nodded immediately, her chest tightening at his vulnerable plea. "Okay, I'll be right back," she assured him firmly, standing up quickly. Her heart pounded anxiously as she moved swiftly toward the galley. She had never challenged a superior before, especially someone as intimidating as Veronica Hart. Yet this wasn't about a passenger unhappy with a meal or seat assignment. This was about a frightened, innocent child, one who'd been mistreated simply due to his appearance, and worse yet, his race. Priya knew she couldn't remain silent this time. Too much was at stake. She found Veronica casually standing by the beverage cart, calmly pouring coffee as though nothing had happened. Priya paused for just half a second, heart racing, before stepping forward resolutely. "Veronica, can I speak with you for a moment?" Veronica barely spared her a glance. "If this is about service rotations, we'll go over it later." "It's about the boy," Priya interrupted firmly, her voice steadied despite her nerves. Veronica finally glanced up, irritation creasing her features sharply. "What about him?" Priya took a slow breath, forcing courage into her voice. "He's upset. He says you hurt his arm." Veronica scoffed dismissively, rolling her eyes. "Oh please, I barely touched him. He was fidgeting and causing a disturbance, and I did what any professional would do. I corrected his behavior." "You didn't just correct him," Priya argued sharply, her jaw tight with emotion. "You grabbed him. Now he's sitting there holding his teddy bear like he's afraid to even move. He didn't deserve that treatment." Veronica's eyes narrowed with hostility. "He should sit still," she snapped bitterly. "Do you realize how many high-paid passengers we have in first class? Nobody wants their flight disrupted by some whining kid who obviously doesn't belong here." Priya felt a wave of disgust wash over her at Veronica's harsh prejudice. Her voice rose slightly in anger and disbelief. "He can't help it. Did you even look at him? His hands tremble. He's clearly struggling to sit comfortably. You didn't treat him like a child. You treated him like a nuisance." Veronica's eyes narrowed dangerously, voice lowering in warning. "Watch your tone, Priya." But Priya refused to back down. "What if someone treated your child like that? Would you be so dismissive then?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered briefly across Veronica's face, a fleeting moment of possible guilt. But it disappeared almost immediately as she straightened her uniform defiantly, refusing to accept responsibility, unaware that her arrogance had set events in motion that would soon shatter everything she valued. Veronica Hart stood by the beverage cart, calmly sipping her coffee as though nothing had happened. Priya Lopez stared at her, stunned by the sheer coldness displayed by her superior. Priya had hoped for even the slightest sign of remorse or self-awareness, yet Veronica showed neither regret nor second thoughts, only chilling indifference. Priya clenched her fists, her heart pounding in frustration. She had tried reasoning with Veronica, appealing to basic compassion and decency, but it was clearly futile. She knew she had to find another way to help Noah Sinclair. Before she could move, the intercom suddenly crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. "Veronica Hart, report to the cockpit immediately," announced Captain Daniel Mercer, his voice stern and uncharacteristically tense. Veronica paused, visibly startled. For the first time that day, her composed facade cracked slightly, her brows knitted in confusion. She shot Priya a brief, suspicious glare before turning abruptly towards the cockpit, swiftly adjusting her uniform. Usually composed and confident, she felt an unfamiliar unease tighten her chest as she approached the front of the aircraft. As she stepped inside the cockpit, Veronica immediately sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Captain Daniel Mercer stood rigidly near the controls, his arms crossed tightly, expression grave. Beside him, Cooper Flynn, the co-pilot, stared straight ahead, clearly uncomfortable. The heavy silence was broken by a voice crackling sharply over the in-flight phone. Cold, steady, and unquestionably authoritative. "Is she there yet?" Captain Mercer cleared his throat before replying evenly, "Yes, sir. Senior Attendant Hart is here." Veronica swallowed hard, anxiety rising sharply. Who is this?" she asked, attempting to mask her uncertainty. Captain Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly, voice cold and measured. "This is Alexander Kane." A chill raced down Veronica's spine. Alexander Kane, the owner and CEO of the airline, the man who had built this empire and whose power extended far beyond the confines of this aircraft. She had never met him personally, but the mere mention of his name drained the color from her face. Her mind raced wildly. How much did he already know? Captain Mercer's voice hardened, filled with barely suppressed anger. "We received a direct complaint from Mr. Kane regarding his son," he said sharply, eyes piercing Veronica with undisguised disappointment. "Would you care to explain why a first-class passenger, a child, was physically mishandled by a senior member of my crew?" Veronica stiffened immediately, scrambling for words. "Captain, this is clearly a misunderstanding." "You grabbed my son's arm," Alexander Kane interrupted abruptly, his voice dangerously quiet, each word dripping with a chilling fury. "My son is sitting terrified in his seat because of you. He told me exactly what happened. Did you think I'd let this slide?" Veronica forced an unsteady smile, desperately attempting to downplay her actions. "Sir, it was nothing serious. The boy was being disruptive, causing a disturbance. He wouldn't sit still, and You simply assumed he didn't belong," Alexander Kane interjected coldly, voice now dangerously low. "You simply humiliated and physically harmed my son because of your own prejudiced judgment. You took one look at him, at his skin color, and decided he couldn't possibly belong in your precious first class." Veronica opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. She felt trapped, fully exposed under Alexander Kane's unflinching gaze. Captain Daniel Mercer exhaled sharply, his expression darkening further. "You're removed from duty immediately after landing, Veronica," he stated decisively. Her eyes widened in shock. "Wait, removed?" Captain Mercer stared at her with contempt, his voice icy. "You thought you could put your hands on a child and just walk away like nothing happened? Did you really believe you could humiliate a passenger, a child, and face no consequences?" Veronica stood frozen, realization crashing down on her. For the first time in her long career, she was powerless, trapped, held accountable. The authority she had wielded carelessly was slipping rapidly through her fingers, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. And just keep working like nothing happened? Captain Daniel Mercer shook his head firmly, eyes darkening in disappointment. No, that's not how this works. Alexander Kane spoke again, his voice colder than ice, cutting sharply through the cockpit speakers. This conversation is far from over, Veronica Hart. You will return to my son immediately, and you will personally apologize to him. And when this flight lands, you'll be answering directly to the airline's executive board. Veronica felt a wave of panic tighten painfully in her chest, her heartbeat accelerating wildly. "Sir, please, She started, her voice unsteady, but the connection abruptly ended. Silence filled the cockpit as Captain Mercer leveled a severe gaze at her. Veronica's palms felt clammy, anxiety clawing at her throat. Her mistake no longer concerned just Noah Sinclair. Now she was answering directly to Alexander Kane himself, the man who owned not only the airline but the very skies through which she was flying. "Go," Captain Mercer instructed curtly, his voice firm and unyielding. Stepping slowly out of the cockpit, Veronica felt the crushing weight of accountability pressing down heavily upon her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked back down the aisle, every step feeling heavier than the last. Passengers barely glanced at her, unaware that Veronica's entire career was collapsing around her before the plane had even landed. Approaching the first-class cabin, her eyes fell upon Noah Sinclair. He remained curled into his seat, desperately clutching Annie, his beloved teddy bear. His eyes were red, his breathing uneven, his small fingers twitching nervously against the armrest. He hadn't moved since their last encounter, paralyzed by shame and fear. Veronica felt a strange, unfamiliar pang in her chest, guilt perhaps, though she quickly tried to dismiss it. From a few rows back, Priya Lopez stood watching closely, her arms crossed tensely, silently daring Veronica to do the right thing. The air grew heavy with anticipation as Veronica stopped stiffly beside Noah's seat. Clearing her throat, she forced herself to speak, her voice strained and uncertain. "Noah?" The boy flinched slightly at the sound of her voice, but didn't raise his eyes. Veronica swallowed hard, fighting against the prideful resistance inside her. "There's been a misunderstanding," she finally said, voice tight and uncomfortable. She hesitated, struggling visibly. "I'd like to apologize." Noah slowly raised his head, cautiously meeting her gaze. His voice was small, yet steady. "You're saying it was a misunderstanding?" Veronica nodded stiffly, struggling to maintain composure. "Yes, it was," she faltered, searching desperately for words that wouldn't further condemn her actions. "An error in judgment." Noah frowned slightly, quiet strength building behind his innocent eyes. "An error in judgment," he repeated softly, thoughtfully tilting his head as if processing her words. "You saw my ticket. You knew it was real, yet you still decided I didn't belong." Veronica's throat tightened painfully, suddenly exposed and vulnerable under the child's gentle yet piercing gaze. For the first time, she had no control over the narrative. She had been stripped of her authority by a small boy who refused to accept her hollow excuses. Her heart raced as passengers nearby subtly shifted, no longer pretending to ignore the unfolding confrontation. "I apologize," Veronica managed finally, the words leaving her lips in a reluctant whisper. Noah looked up at her, his eyes clear, honest, and unwavering. "If you're going to say sorry," he said quietly, firmly meeting her gaze, "you should at least tell the truth." Veronica felt her breath hitch sharply, knowing her moment of accountability had finally arrived, and she had nowhere left to hide. "And yet, you still told me to move," Noah Sinclair said quietly, his voice steady yet firm, carrying clearly through the heavy silence of first class. Passengers around them shifted uneasily in their seats, eyes flickering back to the conversation they'd previously chosen to ignore. Veronica Hart felt an unsettling heat rising to her cheeks, her skin prickling beneath the scrutiny of every passenger now watching her closely. "I may have misjudged the situation," she replied stiffly, avoiding eye contact. But Noah wasn't satisfied. His small hands tightened protectively around Annie, his stuffed teddy bear, as he fixed a steady gaze on Veronica. Without breaking eye contact, he reached carefully toward his tablet, fingers no longer trembling but deliberate and steady. Within seconds, he tapped the screen, sending a quick message. A gentle, yet ominous, ding echoed softly through the tense silence of the cabin, resonating like an unspoken warning. Veronica's pulse quickened painfully in her chest, dread spreading through her as Noah calmly waited. Passengers around them exchanged curious glances, sensing the gravity of the unfolding situation. The silence felt unbearable until Noah's tablet chimed softly. He immediately tapped the screen, and Alexander Kane's deep, firm voice filled the quiet cabin. "Take your time, Noah. Make sure she truly understands exactly what she's done." The blood drained instantly from Veronica's face, leaving her pale and exposed. Noah slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers, his gaze steady, unwavering. He wasn't crying anymore. He wasn't trembling, nor shrinking fearfully into his seat. Instead, he sat up straighter, suddenly imbued with quiet authority, a strength born of knowing his father was on his side. With measured clarity, Noah spoke again, voice calm but carrying a weight that held the entire cabin in its grip. "You didn't ask anyone else here to show their ticket, just me. Why?" The question hung in the air like a heavy accusation, unmistakably clear in its meaning. Veronica's lips parted slightly, but no response came. Her earlier confidence evaporated under Noah's quiet strength, leaving her utterly speechless. She desperately wanted to dismiss the moment, to brush it off as trivial, but Noah wouldn't allow it. Priya Lopez held her breath, watching anxiously from afar as Noah continued softly but unwaveringly. "If you're going to apologize, you should at least tell the truth. You singled me out because of how I look." Veronica felt her throat tighten painfully, panic and shame gripping her simultaneously. The silence deepened, suffocating and merciless, forcing her to face her own actions clearly for the very first time. In that painful, humiliating moment, Veronica Hart realized there was no way to escape accountability this time. Noah Sinclair wasn't going to quietly accept her half-hearted apology. He was forcing her to confront her prejudice, directly and openly, in front of everyone aboard Flight 237. Now, with passengers openly staring, eyes filled with judgment, curiosity, and shock, Veronica Hart faced something she had never experienced before: complete accountability. Noah Sinclair's quiet yet powerful words echoed through the first-class cabin, leaving Veronica trapped, cornered in a confrontation she'd never expected. Every silent second deepened her humiliation. Her pulse quickened, palms growing clammy beneath the stares of passengers who were no longer pretending to ignore her prejudice. They were actively listening, waiting for her to speak. Priya Lopez crossed her arms anxiously, observing Veronica carefully. Priya had never seen the senior attendant so visibly shaken, so utterly cornered. Veronica had always carried herself with a fierce sense of control, believing her judgment unquestionable. But now, her facade was collapsing in real time beneath the calm strength of a child she'd previously dismissed as worthless. Noah Sinclair sat quietly in his seat, fingers tightening protectively around Annie, his beloved stuffed teddy bear, as his eyes locked firmly onto Veronica. His voice was soft yet resolute, cutting straight to the heart of Veronica's prejudice. "You saw my ticket," Noah stated firmly, his tone calm but deeply powerful. "You knew exactly where I belonged, but you still told me to move. Why?" Veronica shifted uneasily, her breath hitching in panic. She started weakly, but the words faltered, dying before they reached her lips. She could feel every passenger's gaze fixed firmly on her, the cabin holding its breath, waiting for the truth, waiting to see whether she'd finally acknowledge her bias. Noah leaned forward slightly, his small hands clutching Annie protectively as he repeated, his voice quiet yet unwavering, "You looked at me, at the color of my skin, and decided I didn't belong here." Silence hung heavily in the air, deafening in its intensity. Passengers who had once turned away now leaned forward, clearly aware they were witnessing something deeply significant. Priya felt her heart ache, nearly pitying Veronica as the truth of her actions became painfully clear. This wasn't merely about a flight attendant losing control of a minor situation. This was about accountability for blatant racial discrimination, exposed openly for all to see. Veronica's mouth opened slightly again, her throat dry, panic and shame warring within her. She desperately tried to formulate an excuse. He was a child, disruptive, possibly out of place. But each potential explanation crumbled immediately, painfully exposing the raw truth. She had judged him because of who he was, because of the color of his skin. She had never asked the polished businessman or the well-dressed woman for their tickets, never once doubted their right to sit comfortably in first class. But Noah, a young black boy holding a stuffed teddy bear, had been immediately seen as an intruder, someone to be controlled, corrected, and cast aside. Noah waited patiently, his fingers tightening protectively around Annie. "If you're going to apologize," he said softly, "at least admit the truth." Veronica felt her chest tighten painfully, trapped between her own pride and undeniable guilt. Her mouth opened again, but the words still wouldn't come. She had no excuses left, nowhere left to hide. For the first time in her career, Veronica Hart faced accountability she couldn't evade, forced by the quiet courage of a child she'd thought powerless. Forced to confront her own prejudice before the watchful eyes of passengers, crew, and the very man who owned the airline himself, waiting patiently on the other end of Noah's tablet for her next words. And Alexander Kane, the influential CEO who could end her entire career with a single phone call, was undoubtedly listening closely. Veronica Hart exhaled shakily, knowing she had nowhere left to hide. Finally, forced by the heavy weight of Noah's unwavering gaze, she swallowed hard and spoke, her voice quiet, strained with reluctant honesty. "I misjudged you. I looked at you and I assumed someone like you couldn't possibly belong here." Priya Lopez's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise, amazed to hear Veronica finally admitting the harsh truth behind her prejudice. Noah Sinclair didn't look away. His small fingers tightened protectively around Annie, his beloved stuffed teddy bear, but his eyes were now steady and calm. He had been vulnerable and frightened moments ago, but now, empowered by the quiet voice of his father, Alexander Kane, waiting patiently on the other end of his tablet, Noah sat straighter and spoke again, his voice gently but powerfully demanding accountability. "Then why did you push me?" Veronica's throat tightened painfully, her pulse racing. The cabin grew deathly quiet, every passenger leaning forward slightly, waiting for her response. She longed to dismiss Noah's accusation, to insist she had barely touched him, that he was exaggerating, but she couldn't. Not now, not with everyone watching, not with Alexander Kane, the powerful CEO whose single word could end her entire career, listening to every detail through Noah's tablet. Veronica exhaled shakily, the weight of the truth settling upon her heavily. "I shouldn't have done that," she finally admitted, voice trembling slightly. "I was impatient and I was wrong." Noah regarded her silently, calmly processing her admission before giving a slight, controlled nod. "Okay," he said quietly, adjusting his stuffed teddy bear, Annie, in his lap. "Now you know." Confusion flickered briefly across Veronica's face. "Okay?" Noah's steady gaze never faltered. "Now you know," he repeated softly but firmly, making clear the weight behind his words. Veronica blinked, momentarily bewildered, feeling utterly exposed. For years she had prided herself on enforcing order, deciding who belonged and who didn't. Now, a small child, a boy she'd instantly dismissed because of his skin color, had forced her to confront her own ugly truth. The realization sank deeply into her chest, sharper and more painful than any official punishment. Breaking the heavy silence, Priya stepped forward gently. "I think that's enough," she said firmly but neutrally, placing a gentle hand on Noah's shoulder. "Let's get you settled comfortably, okay?" Noah nodded quietly, allowing Priya to help him back into his seat. But as he passed Veronica, he paused briefly, lifting his eyes to meet hers again. "Next time," he said softly yet firmly, "don't just see what you expect to see." With those quiet yet piercing words, Noah walked past Veronica Hart, leaving her frozen in the aisle, diminished and utterly exposed before the eyes of everyone on board. Passengers exchanged knowing glances. Some shook their heads with quiet disapproval, while others subtly nodded in deep respect for Noah's calm courage. Priya gently guided Noah back to his seat, carefully adjusting his blanket and softly offering him juice, treating him with the respect Veronica had denied. For Noah, the injustice had finally been openly challenged. But for Veronica Hart, the harshest punishment was yet to come, and it would be swift, devastating, and thoroughly deserved. Priya Lopez gently placed a snack and juice beside Noah Sinclair, treating him with the kindness and dignity Veronica Hart should have offered from the very beginning. Noah accepted the juice, but didn't drink it immediately. Instead, he quietly picked up his tablet, fingers trembling slightly as he tapped out another careful message to his father. Placing the tablet back in his lap, Noah remained silent, his expression calm but unreadable. Veronica Hart stood frozen nearby, her heart racing anxiously. Desperate to retreat, she began taking a cautious step backward when suddenly the aircraft's intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Daniel Mercer's authoritative voice filled the cabin. "We have just received an urgent directive from airline headquarters. All crew members are to remain at their stations as we prepare for landing. Thank you." Veronica's breath caught sharply in her chest as confusion rippled among passengers. A heavy tension settled throughout the cabin as the in-flight phone near the galley buzzed sharply. Priya Lopez and Veronica both turned, eyes locking onto Seth Donovan, another attendant, as he cautiously picked up the phone. "This is flight crew," Seth spoke softly, listening intently. As he listened, his eyes darted sharply toward Veronica, his expression shifting to shock, then uncomfortable realization. Clearing his throat, Seth hung up, turning slowly toward Veronica with an expression devoid of sympathy. "That was headquarters," he said firmly. "You're to remain seated for the remainder of the flight. Security will escort you off immediately after landing." Veronica felt the blood drain from her face, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Her mind raced frantically, disbelief and panic surging within her. "Escorted off? By security?" she stammered, fighting to keep her voice steady. Seth Donovan offered no sympathy, only a firm nod of confirmation. "Yes," he repeated calmly, clearly distancing himself from her. "You're finished here, Veronica." Passengers around them whispered urgently now, no longer hiding their curiosity. Some openly stared, shaking their heads in quiet disgust, having pieced together exactly what had happened. Others quickly typed messages, sharing the scandal unfolding on their phones. The carefully constructed authority Veronica had wielded so proudly was collapsing entirely. Her hands trembled slightly as humiliation overwhelmed her. "This is utterly ridiculous," Veronica muttered defensively, desperately smoothing her uniform with stiff fingers, her voice lacking its earlier arrogance. Priya raised an eyebrow, incredulous. "Ridiculous?" she challenged firmly. Veronica shot her a hostile glare but didn't respond, turning sharply toward Seth instead. "Who exactly gave that order?" she demanded sharply, her tone brittle with anxiety. Seth met her gaze steadily. "The directive came straight from Alexander Kane himself," he stated flatly. The name echoed powerfully through Veronica's mind, striking her like a physical blow. Alexander Kane. The owner of the airline, the influential CEO whose son she had carelessly and cruelly mistreated, had personally ordered her removal. Veronica swallowed hard, lowering her voice to a strained whisper, desperation creeping into her tone. "I was simply doing my job." Priya shook her head incredulously, unable to contain herself. "Your job?" she retorted sharply, her voice edged with disgust. "You physically grabbed a frightened, innocent child, a disabled child. You treated him like an intruder simply because of how he looked. That wasn't your job, Veronica. That was prejudice." Veronica stood speechless, exposed by the harsh truth, as the reality of her own actions finally closed in around her, heavy, merciless, and utterly inescapable. "And treated him as if he was nothing more than an inconvenience," Priya Lopez finished coldly, her voice tight with restrained anger. Veronica's heart stiffened immediately, her jaw locking defensively. "I was maintaining order in first class," she retorted icily. Priya's expression hardened, no longer hiding her contempt. "No," she said firmly, shaking her head slowly. "You weren't keeping order. You were making assumptions based on prejudice, and now you're finally facing the consequences." Veronica's breath hit sharply as panic clawed at her chest. Quickly, her mind raced, desperately searching for a way to escape accountability. Perhaps she could downplay the incident, tell the captain Noah had exaggerated, convince him the child had merely overreacted. But her panicked planning was abruptly interrupted by the shrill chime of the in-flight phone. Seth Donovan answered, his face visibly tensing as he listened. When he hung up, his voice was cold and unyielding. "That was headquarters. Alexander Kane himself has issued direct instructions. You're relieved of duty immediately, Veronica." Veronica felt the announcement strike her like a physical blow, panic rising. "They can't," she began desperately. Seth swiftly cut her off, voice flat, leaving no room for debate. "It's done. You'll receive the official termination notice once we land, but as of right now, you're off duty. You're not to interact with any passengers, including Noah." Priya Lopez watched silently, her eyes flickering briefly with disbelief and a trace of pity. She hadn't expected the punishment to be this swift, this severe. Veronica stood frozen, stomach twisting painfully. "They can't just—" "It's done," Seth repeated bluntly. Gesturing firmly toward the empty crew seat in the galley, his voice hardened further. "Sit." Veronica's cheeks burned with humiliation. To be ordered to sit like a reprimanded passenger, stripped of her authority in front of the entire first-class cabin, was the ultimate disgrace. Passengers were now openly whispering, stealing glances, filled with curiosity and judgment. By the time the plane touched down, this incident would surely ripple through the airline and beyond. Veronica's fingers shook slightly as she stiffly walked toward the galley, sinking slowly into the seat designated for disciplined crew. Hands clasped tightly together, she sat rigidly, her jaw clenched as humiliation burned through every nerve in her body. A short time ago, she had walked these aisles confidently, wielding authority and enforcing order. Now, she was merely another passenger, sitting helplessly beneath judgment. Meanwhile, Noah sat quietly, finally at ease, gently clutching Annie in his lap. He picked up his tablet as a new message appeared. "Daddy, I'll be waiting at the gate when you land." A small, knowing smile tugged softly at Noah's lips. Veronica Hart thought the punishment was already over, but in truth, it had barely even begun. The airplane began its descent, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Passengers, previously absorbed in meals or entertainment, now exchanged cautious glances and murmured discreetly, sensing they were witnessing more than just another airline dispute. They were watching justice unfold, witnessing the powerful consequences of prejudice and discrimination firsthand. "And prepare for landing. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin." Captain Daniel Mercer's authoritative voice filled the aircraft, jolting Veronica Hart back to the harsh reality she now faced. Her stomach churned violently, anxiety clawing painfully at her insides. Across the aisle, Priya Lopez moved methodically through her duties, carefully checking passenger seatbelts and ensuring everything was secure. When she reached Noah Sinclair's seat, she paused softly, gently checking his seatbelt. Noah looked up calmly, clutching Annie, his beloved teddy bear, comfortingly in his lap. His voice was steady now, filled with quiet assurance. "My dad's going to be there when we land," he said softly, a hint of confidence returning to his previously frightened eyes. Priya hesitated, sensing something beyond Noah's simple words, something certain and powerful. She nodded gently, offering him a warm smile. "Good," she whispered reassuringly, her voice gentle and sincere. "You deserve that." As Priya walked away, she glanced briefly toward Veronica Hart, who sat stiffly in the crew seat in the galley, fingers gripping the edges of her uniform skirt so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Veronica's face was pale, anxiety clearly etched into every line of her features. For the first time in her once perfect career, Veronica felt the overwhelming weight of genuine accountability pressing heavily upon her. The moment the aircraft touched down, passengers immediately reached for their phones, the familiar chimes and buzzes filling the cabin. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. Passengers no longer pretended to ignore the incident. Whispers grew louder, eyes flickering openly toward Veronica, judgment and curiosity now unmistakably present in their gazes. 2 rows ahead, Seth Donovan answered the in-flight phone. His eyes widened slightly as he listened, his expression stiffening further. Finally, he ended the call and turned directly toward Veronica. "You're to remain seated until all passengers have exited. Security will escort you off the plane." Veronica's eyes snapped to him sharply, panic flaring in her voice. "Escorted? To where?" Seth remained composed, unaffected by her rising panic. "To the executive office," he said flatly. "Alexander Kane himself has ordered a formal inquiry." Veronica's breath caught painfully, dread twisting her stomach. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words emerged. This was more than a mere disciplinary action. It was an immediate public reckoning. The passengers nearby, sensing the gravity, had fallen quiet, exchanging knowing glances. Priya exhaled slowly, murmuring under her breath, "I warned you." The passengers began to disembark, gathering belongings swiftly. As they filed out, Noah carefully stood up, gripping Annie closely in one hand, his tablet in the other. Slowly, he walked toward the exit, calm and composed, each step filled with quiet dignity. He knew exactly who was waiting at the gate. As Noah stepped off the aircraft onto the jet bridge, Alexander Kane stood waiting, arms crossed, his presence commanding instant respect. Passengers glanced nervously in his direction, recognizing him immediately as the powerful CEO of the airline. Noah looked up, eyes brightening as a warm smile spread across his face. "Hi, Daddy." Alexander knelt down gently, his expression softening immediately as he placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "Are you all right?" Noah nodded softly, holding Annie closer. "I am now." Alexander's expression darkened briefly as his gaze shifted toward the aircraft door. Veronica Hart was now stepping onto the jet bridge, flanked by 2 uniformed security officers. The passengers lingering nearby openly watched, some pretending to check their phones, others observing without disguise. Veronica froze as she saw Alexander Kane standing before her, her heart dropping sharply. His quiet, commanding presence alone was enough to silence any protest. She tried desperately to speak, to offer some explanation, anything that might redeem her, but Alexander simply tilted his head slightly, his voice calm yet deadly cold as he addressed her directly. "Miss Hart," Alexander said, each word cutting sharply through the heavy silence. "I think we need to have a conversation." And the sheer weight of Alexander Kane's gaze silenced her instantly. "Follow me," Alexander said, his voice low, controlled, and unreadable. Veronica Hart obeyed immediately, unable to find her voice. She didn't dare glance back toward the terminal crowd, knowing exactly what she'd see. Judgmental whispers, accusing glances, and the rapid spreading of news about her downfall. She followed Alexander Kane silently down a private corridor reserved for airline executives, every step echoing against the polished floors, heavier than the last. Her heart raced as she entered the private conference room, the door closing softly yet ominously behind her. The room was large and intimidatingly elegant, dominated by a polished table surrounded by luxurious leather chairs, far grander than anything she'd ever encountered before. She sank stiffly into a seat, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, palms clammy with anxiety. The door opened quietly again, revealing Victoria Kane, Alexander's wife. Entering gracefully, her eyes were sharp, analytical, framed by elegant dark-rimmed glasses as she took a seat beside Alexander. Veronica's stomach churned painfully. She'd met Victoria briefly at a corporate event long ago and immediately understood she was formidable. Someone who carried power effortlessly, someone who did not tolerate injustice. Then, the door opened a final time. Noah Sinclair entered, carefully stepping into the conference room. He stood quietly between his parents, clutching Annie, the teddy bear Veronica had mocked, in his hands. Yet he no longer looked vulnerable or afraid. He stood confidently, his expression steady, his head held high. Victoria Kane broke the heavy silence first, her tone dangerously calm. "You know exactly why we're here, Ms. Hart." Veronica swallowed painfully, forcing herself to nod tightly. Alexander Kane leaned forward slightly, his penetrating gaze unwavering. "Do you truly understand?" Veronica struggled to respond, her voice small, hesitant. "I understand I've been called here regarding an issue with a passenger." Victoria raised a delicate eyebrow, unimpressed by the vague attempt to evade accountability. "An issue?" she repeated icily, leaning forward slightly. "You deliberately humiliated, mistreated, and physically handled a child, a first-class passenger, solely based on your prejudiced assumptions about him." Veronica felt her breath hitch painfully. I didn't mean..." Alexander cut her off coldly, his gaze cutting deeper than his words. "I don't care what you meant," he said quietly but sharply. "I care about what you did." A suffocating silence fell heavily upon the room. Veronica's fingers curled desperately in her lap, her breath shaky and uneven. For the first time, she had no defense. Her authority had evaporated completely. Alexander Kane leaned forward slowly, his eyes piercing hers relentlessly. "You know exactly why you targeted my son, Veronica," he said, voice hard and cold. "You saw his skin color, his vulnerability, and immediately decided he didn't belong in your carefully ordered first class." Veronica opened her mouth weakly. I didn't mean..." "You made your choice," Alexander interrupted harshly. "I don't need excuses, and I don't want explanations. I only care about what you did." Noah Sinclair silently watched Veronica closely, quietly absorbing the moment. He stood tall, his presence now quietly powerful rather than vulnerable. This confrontation was no longer just about him. It was about justice, accountability, and exposing the cruel prejudice Veronica Hart had so easily hidden behind a facade of authority for years. Noah Sinclair stepped forward slightly, tilting his head as he spoke, his voice steady and filled with quiet conviction. "You thought I didn't belong here," he said softly, yet his words echoed clearly and powerfully through the tense silence of the executive conference room. "Because of how I look." Veronica Hart's throat tightened painfully, her hands clenched so firmly in her lap that her knuckles turned bone white. The suffocating silence of the executive office pressed heavily around her, the weight of her prejudice fully exposed. This was no longer merely about airline policy or customer service guidelines. This was about confronting the undeniable truth of her own deeply ingrained bias. And Noah Sinclair, the young boy she'd so easily judged and dismissed, now stood before her, calmly waiting for her answer. Alexander Kane exhaled slowly, leaning forward deliberately, his calm demeanor carrying a chilling authority that lowered the temperature of the room. "You've worked for this airline for how long, Veronica?" Her voice trembled as she whispered, barely audible. 12 years. 12 years, Alexander repeated softly, deliberately, his gaze unwaveringly intense. Yet, after 12 years, you decided in an instant that it was appropriate to humiliate my son and put your hands on him. Simply because you assumed he didn't belong in first class? I didn't, Veronica began desperately, but Alexander raised his hand sharply, silencing her instantly. You thought he didn't belong, Alexander continued coldly. Just say it clearly. Admit the truth. Veronica's stomach dropped painfully, realizing the moment she'd feared had finally come. The passengers had whispered it. Priya Lopez had implied it. Seth Donovan had seen it clearly. But now Alexander Kane himself forced her to openly confront it. She had looked at Noah, saw his dark skin, his quiet discomfort, his innocent vulnerability, and immediately judged him unworthy of first class. She had humiliated him publicly, physically mistreated him, and justified it with nothing more than prejudice. Victoria Kane leaned forward slightly, her calm voice cutting through Veronica's shame like ice. A mistake, she echoed coldly, each word sharp as a blade. A mistake is forgetting someone's drink order or misplacing a meal. You deliberately put your hands on our son because you believed he didn't belong here. Noah tightened his small fingers around Annie, his beloved teddy bear, but his voice remained calm and steady, filled with quiet courage. Would you have treated me the same way if I had looked like everyone else? He asked softly, eyes fixed firmly on Veronica. Veronica's heart pounded violently. She knew the truth, felt it twisting painfully in her chest. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his voice growing colder and deadlier. I've dealt with people like you before, Veronica. People who think a uniform and a little authority gives them the right to judge who belongs. But your assumption, your prejudice, is exactly why you're finished here. For the first time in her career, Veronica Hart sat completely stripped of her power, her authority crumbling, forced to face the crushing consequences of her own prejudice. And who doesn't? Alexander Kane paused deliberately, letting the heavy silence emphasize the gravity of his words, before continuing, voice sharp with authority. You don't get to decide that, Veronica. You never did. Veronica Hart felt her chest tighten painfully, every carefully maintained piece of her composure crumbling beneath Alexander's cold, unyielding stare. Her heart pounded in panic as she struggled to hold onto her quickly unraveling dignity. Across the polished conference table, Victoria Kane adjusted her glasses calmly before sliding a tablet toward Veronica. Your employment with this airline is hereby terminated, effective immediately, Victoria announced firmly, her voice devoid of sympathy. Additionally, you will receive an official notice barring you from future employment with any subsidiary under our airline's corporate umbrella. Terminated? Veronica's voice cracked, her breath hitching sharply. Desperation crept into her words. I understand a suspension, but I've given this airline 12 years of my life. Alexander Kane's expression remained unwavering, his voice calm yet deadly serious. In those 12 years, Veronica, did you ever stop once, just once, to consider how many other passengers you've judged unfairly? Veronica froze instantly, realization crashing into her like a wave of ice-cold water. She had spent years making snap judgments, deciding within seconds who deserved courtesy, who deserved respect, and who didn't. Decisions always hidden behind her confident facade of authority. But now she saw the truth clearly. Noah wasn't the first passenger she'd unfairly targeted, just the first to openly confront her prejudice. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice firm and precise. "You're not merely losing your job, Ms. Hart. Effective immediately, you're terminated. Furthermore, you'll receive a formal notice barring you from employment within any airline affiliated with Kane Global Aviation." Veronica's stomach twisted violently as the severity of Victoria's words sank in. This wasn't just dismissal. It was career-ending. News would spread quickly throughout the airline industry, her reputation permanently stained. Her name would be whispered in HR departments, her actions remembered with condemnation. Panic flooded her as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. "Mr. Kane," Veronica tried desperately, her voice shaking now. "Please, isn't there any way to reconsider?" Alexander Kane's eyes narrowed slightly, voice lowering dangerously. "If our roles were reversed, would you have given my son a second chance?" Veronica froze, unable to answer. Alexander leaned forward further, speaking softly but with lethal clarity. "Would you have allowed him to remain in first class? Would you have even apologized if someone hadn't forced your hand?" She didn't answer, because the truth was painfully clear. She would never have apologized. She'd have confidently justified her prejudice, swiftly dismissing Noah without a second thought. Alexander's silence was confirmation enough. Veronica's breath trembled as two security officers quietly stepped into the room, waiting silently by the door. The finality of the moment crushed her completely. Veronica stood up slowly, mechanically, her face pale and devoid of expression. She didn't dare glance back at Alexander Kane or Victoria Kane, not even at Noah Sinclair, who watched silently, holding Annie tightly yet calmly at his side. As Veronica turned stiffly towards the waiting officers, her pride shattered. Her career, her reputation, everything she'd spent years building had crumbled instantly beneath the weight of her exposed prejudice. The very authority she'd wielded so carelessly against Noah was now being used to remove her, and she definitely didn't look at Noah Sinclair. Veronica Hart walked slowly toward the door, her legs feeling unbearably heavy, her chest painfully tight, the shattered fragments of her once proud career scattered irretrievably behind her. As she stepped out of the executive office, she heard Noah's gentle voice one last time, quiet yet powerful, echoing clearly through the closed door. "Now you know what it feels like to be told you don't belong." The words reverberated deeply within her, each syllable striking painfully, a truth impossible to escape. Veronica's breath grew shallow as two security officers silently flanked her, waiting for her to move. No handcuffs, no dramatic escort, just quiet, undeniable authority making it clear she was no longer welcome. Her shoes clicked softly against the polished floors of the airline headquarters, each step echoing like an accusation, marking her as the very thing she'd always despised, someone who didn't belong. As the officers quietly guided her toward a secluded employee exit, panic raced through her mind. Would she ever find employment in the industry again? How long would it take before news spread? Her name whispered in gossip, her reputation permanently stained. For 12 years she'd effortlessly decided who belonged and who didn't, wielding prejudice disguised as authority, dismissing passengers without a second thought. Now she had become the whispered about, the judged, the unwelcome, and the bitter irony of that reversal cut deeply into her pride. At last, reaching a private employee exit, Veronica stopped, taking a shaky breath. "Am I free to go?" she asked weakly, voice barely a whisper. One officer nodded curtly. "You're not under arrest, but you need to leave quietly." She pushed open the door slowly, stepping out into the bright daylight. Blinking rapidly, trying to adjust her eyes to the glaring sun, Veronica froze instantly at the sight of Priya Lopez standing beside a sleek black town car parked near the curb, arms crossed firmly, expression unwaveringly calm. Veronica's stomach twisted sharply, her breath catching. She'd expected Priya to still be inside, quietly finishing her duties, pretending nothing happened. Yet here she was, openly waiting, her gaze unyielding. "What do you want?" Veronica demanded defensively, trying and failing to sound firm, her voice betraying a faint tremor. Priya regarded her carefully, then shook her head slowly, disappointment clear in her expression. "I wanted to see what it looked like when someone like you finally faced real consequences." Veronica swallowed hard, desperate to salvage a shred of dignity. "I made a mistake," she managed quietly, though her words rang hollow. Priya's gaze hardened, unrelenting. "No, Veronica, you made a choice." The words stung deeply, piercing through her last defensive barriers. Priya was right. For years, Veronica had believed herself above accountability, hiding behind rules she'd twisted to justify her own prejudices. Now, confronted openly with her own actions, she felt something deeper than mere humiliation, a painful, undeniable truth she could no longer escape. And now Veronica Hart stood silently outside the airline headquarters, fully aware she'd never again set foot inside its walls. Priya Lopez studied Veronica for a long, thoughtful moment before finally sighing softly. "You know," she began quietly, "when I first started working with you, I genuinely thought you were someone who never made mistakes, someone who always knew what was right." Veronica's throat tightened painfully, unable to meet Priya's steady gaze. "But now," Priya continued, her voice firm yet tinged with sadness, "I see clearly who you really are." Veronica felt a cold knot settle deep in her stomach, twisting painfully. "I made a mistake," she whispered weakly, desperation in her voice. "No," Priya replied firmly, shaking her head slowly. "You made a choice." The words stung deeper than Veronica expected, each syllable forcing her to confront her own ugly prejudice. Priya turned away without another word, leaving Veronica utterly alone and exposed in the parking lot. Veronica stood motionless, barely registering the warm breeze brushing gently against her skin or the distant murmur of airport traffic. Her chest felt tight, panic rising steadily within her as the brutal reality of her situation sank in fully. Her career was shattered. Authority she'd arrogantly wielded against passengers for 12 long years was now stripped from her completely. She had prided herself on deciding who belonged, enforcing rules that masked her own prejudice. But today she was the one deemed unworthy, the one denied entry. Slowly, painfully, Veronica forced herself to move, crossing the parking lot toward her car, each step heavy with shame. Her mind raced anxiously, thoughts spiraling uncontrollably. Would she ever find employment again? How many airlines would refuse her, knowing her history? Her name would become a cautionary tale whispered in HR offices across the industry. Finally reaching her car, she opened the door with trembling fingers, sinking weakly into the driver's seat. She sat motionless, staring blankly at the dashboard as memories haunted her. The cold judgment in Alexander Kane's eyes, Victoria Kane's quiet yet cutting words, and most devastatingly, Noah Sinclair's calm voice challenging her prejudice. She had dismissed countless passengers over the years without hesitation, never truly understanding their discomfort or pain. Now, for the first time, she saw herself clearly through their eyes. Cruel, arrogant, unjust. Veronica inhaled sharply, realization dawning painfully within her. If Noah hadn't been the son of the powerful airline owner, she would have continued her career, confidently believing she was right, blind to her own cruelty. The thought churned her stomach with nauseating dread. How many others like her held authority, silently making decisions rooted in prejudice every single day? She felt something inside her finally crack open, revealing a truth she'd never dared confront. She had never been fair. She'd simply hidden discrimination beneath authority, and now, forced to see herself clearly for the first time, regret surged deeply, painfully within her. The punishment wasn't just losing her job. It was facing herself as others had always seen her. And now she was left alone, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, haunted by a single question she had never truly considered. Had she ever been fair? For 12 long years, Veronica Hart had meticulously built her career, authority, and reputation, never pausing even once to question if she'd ever been genuinely fair. Now, sitting alone in the silence of her car, stripped of all authority, she finally faced that question, and the devastating truth was clear: she had no answer. Perhaps that was the worst punishment of all. Inside the airport's private lounge, Noah Sinclair sat quietly, his small legs swinging slightly from the seat, comfortably holding Annie, his worn teddy bear. Beside him, Alexander Kane quietly adjusted the cuffs of his immaculate suit jacket, his gaze softening gently as he studied his son. "You okay?" Alexander asked gently, placing a reassuring hand on Noah's shoulder. Noah looked up, smiling softly as the warmth and safety of his father's presence enveloped him. "I am now," he whispered quietly, his earlier fear now replaced by calm assurance. Victoria Kane observed them both thoughtfully for a long moment before finally breaking the silence. She looked shaken when she left. Alexander exhaled slowly, carefully adjusting his cuffs. "Good," he replied firmly, though not without a hint of quiet sadness. She needed to be. Victoria tilted her head slightly, voice calm but thoughtful. "Do you think she learned anything?" Alexander considered her question deeply, pausing thoughtfully before responding. "That's up to her," he finally said quietly. "Learning from this moment requires facing truths she may never be ready to confront." Noah Sinclair looked thoughtfully up at his father. "Do you think she'll understand what happened today?" he asked softly. Alexander paused briefly, carefully considering his son's question. Finally, he met Noah's gaze gently. "I don't know, Noah. Understanding takes time, but one thing is certain: she'll never forget it. And sometimes, remembering is the first step toward real change." Noah nodded slowly, processing the meaning behind his father's words. Today had been deeply painful, but also profoundly meaningful. Veronica Hart had confronted consequences she had never imagined facing, forced to see herself through the eyes of those she'd unfairly judged for so many years. For Noah, this wasn't merely about punishment. It was about truth, accountability, and maybe, just maybe, the hope of change. Alexander gently ruffled his son's hair, a soft smile forming on his lips. "Come on," he said warmly. "Let's go home." Noah returned his father's smile brightly, picking up Annie and his tablet before sliding carefully off the seat. He reached up, gripping Alexander's hand firmly as they walked confidently toward the exit, leaving behind the whispers, judgments, and prejudices. Today, a young boy who had been unjustly treated because of his race had confronted injustice with quiet strength and emerged stronger, no longer questioning his place in the world. At first glance, this story might appear as a straightforward narrative about an arrogant flight attendant who faces the consequences of mistreating a passenger. But upon deeper reflection, the true significance becomes clear. It's a stark reminder about the destructive power of prejudice, discrimination, and unchecked assumptions. The encounter between Veronica Hart and young Noah Sinclair, a child whose only crime was sitting in a seat where he unquestionably belonged, underscores how easily and dangerously prejudice can manifest itself in everyday life. This story isn't just about one unfortunate incident on an airplane. It's about the silent, daily prejudices that many people face, judgments based solely upon their appearance, ethnicity, or perceived differences. Veronica Hart symbolizes a very real and troubling reality. Individuals who hold positions of authority often allow personal biases to guide their decisions, resulting in severe and lasting emotional scars inflicted on others. The painful truth is that Noah's experience, while dramatized here, echoes the real-world experiences of countless people of color every day. moments when their very presence is questioned, challenged, or outright rejected simply because of who they are. For years, Veronica Hart believed she was merely enforcing rules, maintaining order and professionalism. Yet beneath her professional exterior lay hidden biases, deep-seated prejudices she likely never consciously acknowledged. She judged Noah swiftly, not because of his behavior or lack of decorum, but because his appearance didn't match her preconceived notions of who deserved to sit in first class. Veronica never imagined that one day she'd face accountability. And this is perhaps one of the most critical lessons of this story. Accountability eventually finds its way to those who misuse power or authority, especially when prejudice forms the basis of their decisions. But the story isn't merely about punishment. It's also about understanding and growth. Noah Sinclair, despite experiencing profound humiliation and mistreatment, chose a path of quiet dignity rather than anger or bitterness. His measured calmness, his unyielding demand for truth, carried more weight than shouting or anger ever could. Noah demonstrated incredible emotional strength in demanding accountability from Veronica, without resorting to hostility or resentment. In his steady voice and composed demeanor, Noah embodied the powerful idea that true strength isn't found in aggressive confrontation, but in the quiet, determined pursuit of justice. Alexander Kane's actions as Noah's father and as a powerful CEO reinforce another vital lesson. Power should always be used responsibly, ethically, and compassionately. Alexander Kane didn't abuse his position to seek revenge. Instead, he calmly and decisively insisted upon accountability, providing a clear example of how influential individuals can leverage their positions to challenge injustice and initiate meaningful change. For every Veronica Hart who misuses authority, society desperately needs an Alexander Kane, someone unafraid to confront injustice head-on, using their influence to protect and defend those most vulnerable. As viewers, we must ask ourselves how often we might have unintentionally acted like Veronica Hart, making judgments about people based on assumptions, appearances, race, or perceived differences. It can be easy and comfortable to believe that prejudice is something only overtly hateful people practice. But the uncomfortable reality is far subtler. Prejudice can live quietly within even those who genuinely consider themselves fair-minded, surfacing subtly in unexamined biases. Veronica's refusal to acknowledge her wrongdoing until forced highlights a deeper truth. To truly overcome prejudice, one must be brave enough to look honestly inward, confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, and make meaningful changes in the ways we interact with others. Another crucial perspective is shown through Priya Lopez, the junior flight attendant who courageously spoke up, despite the potential risks involved. Priya embodies the vital role that allyship plays in confronting injustice. Silence in the face of discrimination only allows prejudice to flourish. Priya chose courage instead of comfort, compassion instead of convenience, and empathy instead of indifference. Her willingness to speak truth to power, even quietly and respectfully, created a ripple effect that ultimately led to accountability and justice. Her courage teaches us that no matter how intimidating or hopeless it seems, standing up for what's right is always worth it. Every voice matters, especially those that speak out in defense of those who can't easily defend themselves. The powerful culmination of the story, when Veronica faces direct confrontation and ultimate termination, offers both catharsis and a profound reflection. Losing her job wasn't merely punishment. It forced Veronica Hart to finally see herself as others had seen her for years. This moment reveals perhaps the deepest lesson of all. Prejudice doesn't just harm the victims. It also diminishes those who hold it. Veronica's inability to answer a simple question, had she ever truly been fair, is tragically telling. Her failure to reflect honestly on her biases over many years ultimately led her to this moment, humiliated, defeated, and lost. For viewers watching this story, The takeaway should be both personal and collective. On a personal level, we must challenge ourselves constantly, examining our thoughts, assumptions, and actions to ensure that we aren't falling into patterns of prejudice. We must commit ourselves to genuine empathy, seeking to understand people beyond surface appearances, and remembering always that every individual deserves dignity and respect. Collectively, we must recognize the dangers posed by systemic prejudice and discrimination. It's crucial that we actively build environments, whether in our workplaces, schools, or communities, where everyone truly belongs, where no one feels the pain of exclusion or humiliation simply for existing. To create meaningful change, we must hold accountable those who misuse their power, just as Alexander Kane did in this story, and consistently speak out against injustice, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Finally, this narrative encourages viewers to consider the kind of world we want to build. One powerful lesson we can carry forward is that compassion and empathy should never be considered signs of weakness or inconvenience. Instead, they're the strongest foundations for building fairness, equality, and genuine community. A society in which people like Noah Sinclair feel secure, valued, and protected is one worth striving toward. It starts with every individual viewer watching, reflecting, and deciding to act differently in their own lives. If you've resonated with this powerful story, remember that it reflects experiences that occur daily, often unnoticed. Let's not merely sympathize, but let this moment become a catalyst for change, motivating us to live with greater kindness, awareness, and genuine fairness. Prejudice will persist only as long as we remain silent. When we choose understanding, compassion, and justice, when we choose accountability over silence, we build a better world, one in which a child like Noah Sinclair can board a flight without fear, confident in the knowledge that he truly belongs. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. How did you feel when Veronica Hart faced the consequences of her actions? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? We'd love to hear your perspective. And remember, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more powerful stories that expose prejudice and celebrate justice. Thank you for watching, reflecting, and taking this journey with us. Together, we can turn powerful stories like these into powerful realities of fairness, respect, and justice.